Hello and welcome to ConTinual, the never-ending convention. My name is Jean Marie Ward and I'll be your host today for Stage to Page. Writers talk about their experiences in the theater, on video, and on film. With me to discuss that topic today are AJ Hartley, Alledria Hurt, Tamsin Silver, Doc Coleman, and Judy Black. Welcome, everyone. Okay, first up, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves, starting with Judy. So, tell us a little bit about you.
I have done theater since I was a very young child and pretty much grew up on the stage. So that was my first love, so to speak. And now I use a lot of that in Dungeons and Dragons. I write a lot of Dungeons and Dragons modules for sale. And I also write mystery novels, including the Finnegan Cabinet of Aberrations, which is a sideshow in 1903 America, which is all sorts of fun of getting to kind of pull up theatrical tropes and all the behind the scenes fun stuff.
Okay, cool. Doc?
I also started off in theater at a young age. And in fact, I just realized exactly how young I was. But for many years, I wanted to be an actor. Didn't have any inclinations towards writing. Did theater in high school and a little bit in college, and then had to go out and get a day job, and that all kind of fell away for a long time. And then I fell in with a bunch of podcasters, and they corrupted me both to voice acting and got me into writing. And I started writing steampunk.
Yeah, funny thing that would never have guessed it from your background.
Yep.
Okay, AJ, looking at your background, I'm thinking, oh my God, something terrifying in far future sci-fi, but that's not really you, is it?
It's not. This is just my house.
Now that looks like you. Okay, tell us a bit about yourself.
I guess I grew up around theater because my father was a high school drama teacher and did a lot of sort of amateur theatrics and stuff like that. But I wasn't particularly involved in it until I was in grad school in Boston, when I set up my own theater company to do non-Shakespearean Renaissance drama. I was I was getting my PhD in Shakespeare Studies, which is what I do as a day job, I guess. I teach at University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and specifically as a Shakespearean. And over the years, my PhD was in English, but I gradually sort of reconnected with theater. I was the dramaturg for Georgia Shakespeare Festival for a decade, and I became sort of primarily a scholar on performance history and theory, which is mostly what I write about as an academic. Obviously, I'm also a novelist. I've published, I think, 25 novels, mystery, thriller, fantasy, sci-fi, some for kids, some for adults.
Okay. Alledria, what about you? Tell us about yourself.
Well, unlike the rest of we've heard from so far, I did not start in theater. I started being that kid who read every book in the house by the time I was 10. So I actually moved into theater later when I decided on a lark that I was just going to apply to be an actor in one of the I was going to audition, let's use the right word, to be in a play in my high school. I did not get chosen, but I hung around with the drama club and I was like, okay, I'm gonna hang out for a bit. I'm gonna learn a few things. And I started writing, and then I turned around and I said, you know what, that theater thing? Maybe. And then I became a tour guide, and that's essentially theater. Mm-hmm. That's that is what you do, is you are a one-person show for anywhere from an hour to two. And that is still my day job.
Mhm. Okay. Tamsin?
Hi, my name is Tamsin Silver. I am an author with Falstaff Books. I write both urban fantasy and historical fantasy. However, I ended up seeing a play when I was very young, and my mother says I turned to her and said, I can do that. Leos. Um, and so I started doing theater. That would have been the summer before 7th grade. You know, just a hot minute ago. So and as we talk more about our experience in theater, I'll talk more about where that took me. But and then eventually I've always wanted to write though. So I started writing in high school by hand during class.
Mhm.
ADHD, got to be doing something to do something else. And so, and I found love. My father read to me from a very young age, and he read fantasy novels to me and stuff. So I fell in love with that. And then I discovered Nancy Drew, and which explains why now I do a lot of urban fantasy, because it's fantasy and it's magic and it's mystery kind of combined.
And they're girls.
Yep.
Yeah, Nancy Drew has a lot to answer for, all of it good. Okay, well, you know, we sort of blew right past the first question I had planned to ask, which was, you know, how did you all get involved? Would you like to talk about your initial experiences in the theater a little bit more? How about you, Doc? You know, want to expand on that a little bit?
I hadn't realized it until we were setting up, but I actually started theater in the 3rd grade. And part of that was because we were reading reading a story out loud in class, and the teacher liked the way that I read enough that she decided that we were going to do this story as the school play, and I was going to be the main character. And that story was The Dragon and the George. And so I got to play the dragon and had to go home and tell my mom that I need a dragon costume.
Oh no.
But
I want photos.
That was for many years that dragon had lurked in my house, in the house I grew up in. I think they finally gave it away to a theater company, but that pretty much got me started. And I grew up in a relatively small town, but we had a local college that did various town and gown performances during the summer. And even though I was a kid, if they were doing a show and I thought there were kids roles, I would go out and audition. So I was the Crown Prince in The King and I, and I also, what did I do later? I missed out on Babes in Arms, but I ended up being a cop in an Agatha Christie cozy mystery type thing. But and then I did theater in high school and ran afoul of the local drama teacher and got kicked out of theater. Went off to college, and since I've been kicked out of theater, I was heavy into the math and sciences, but I saw a sign for auditions. So I said, well, let's see if I really have talent or if it's just because I was from a small town. Ended up, went to audition for Dracula. Somebody talked me into going with him to the other audition to read lines, and ended up with a part in the Diviners. So I don't know. 'Cause, 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 'c I figured I at least had some talent for it, but
Getting cast is always a good sign of talent.
getting cast is always good.
But
after college, it was a lot of things were work, so I did kind of what Judy did, and I turned to D&D. Turned to D&D and role playing for many years in order to get my acting fix in, and then a friend of mine offered me a job at the local Renaissance Festival.
okay.
So I went and I didn't even perform. I ran a game at the Renaissance Festival, which is 4 hours of improv split up during the day.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's where I met one of the podcasters that I laid into, who got me into podcasting and got me into writing.
Okay.
And
Cool.
I've been on too long.
And voice acting, yes. Yes.
And voice acting, yes.
Okay. Judy, I saw you jumping up in your chair and very excited about D&D. Could you talk a bit about, your acting experiences and, how it plays into how D&D figures into that?
It's interesting because I primarily was in musical theater, so I did a bunch of Andrew Lloyd Webber stuff, and then occasionally I did like radio ads and things for Nick Radio, Disney Radio. I don't even remember.
Well, Nick Radio was a thing. I seem to recall it. Yeah.
So I did a few things for them, but I mainly did musical theater, which is wild because I don't do a whole lot of like musical episodes for my players very often. I probably should now. Maybe I think about it. But it is a way for me to perform almost, it's an improv set, essentially, is what you're doing, is you are performing an improv acting session with other people that are throwing things at you. You can do silly accents, and it's just, it's a little, for me, it seems like a little less pressure than a stage. I still have flashbacks of when I was very young and I forgot my lines on stage, and the line was, "He looks nice." And he looks, and just froze and just stood there repeating "he looks" for about 30 seconds, which was probably my entire lifetime at that point, because I think I was about 7 at that point. So it feels like a little less pressure for me to not have the memorized lines and to not be worrying about I'm going to freeze and not know what to say, because I don't know what to say until it comes out of my mouth with that sort of improv. And so that's a little bit what it's like for me, is how it's kind of helped. And I think acting has helped me be a little bit quicker on my feet with responding to things, even in writing. I'll come up with a wild idea while writing and be like, oh wait, that works, hold on. So it's an interesting little song and dance number, I suppose.
The idea of improv makes me think of your experiences as a tour guide, Alledria. Could you tell us a bit about your early experiences and, give us a hint about how acting and tour guiding are very similar? I mean, I know what it felt like when I was doing the John Carlisle house here in Alexandria, but I didn't have to be in costume. So could you give us a little bit about that?
Well, being a tour guide has always been, when I first got into tour guiding about 10 years ago, I was initially trained on a script. And I immediately, once you start doing a script, you start hearing how the cadence moves or how the timing should be, especially when you start dealing with, I have to get to this when I get to this spot. Blocking becomes very important, especially when you're on a moving vehicle that is going past certain things, and I have to talk about this when I reach here, because if I don't, I miss my opportunity. And so first there was the scripting, and then there was learning the timing and the blocking, and then there was and then as you get further along, you find out that there's also a fair element of improv involved with it, because you have to deal with the fact that this person just stepped on my line. This person just asked me a question and I can't just straight up ignore them. This person's child is crying and I need to kind of I need to at least acknowledge that. It all becomes an interplay, and I have a 90-minute tour that is almost as much about my audience as it is about me. It's a one-person show, but if I didn't have an audience, it wouldn't be the same show. So every new audience gives me a different show. And that's part of what I learned in doing theater is like, I did my first piece of Shakespeare a couple of years ago, and I flowed into knowing how to do the blocking and how to understand where I was supposed to be in position for this line, because this line does this thing and this object is required for this line. And that was just, my director was like, have you ever done this before? And I'm like, no, I've never been in a serious stage production in my life. And she was just like, you move like you know what you're doing. And I'm like, I got no idea, but thank you for the compliment.
I was going to say, I would imagine you also need to learn how to fill, because if you're doing tour guiding and you go fast enough so that people can ask questions, and then nobody asks questions, you still have to keep them engaged before you get to your next mark.
Yes, you do have to know how to fill time. You have to know how to fill time. You have to learn how to clip. You have to learn how to stretch, because you may, especially with the fact that I work in a trolley tour, I work on a moving vehicle, which means I also have to contend with traffic. So it all plays into itself to become a show. And it's fun. I mean, I've been doing it for a decade. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Tamsin, what about you? You know, what are your, what have been your theatrical and video or film experiences? Because I know you've done a web series.
Yeah.
So did you act in it as well as write it?
No. There was enough to do as it was. I ended up producer on it. And so it took up much time. I did cook for like 60 people, which was impressive to this day. I still think of that as kind of like, ooh.
I didn't even think about cooking as a necessary stage skill. I'm sorry.
So yeah, no, when you're doing film and you don't have craft, you can't afford to pay for someone who's doing craft services, you do it. No, it was an interesting progression. Real quick, it went from me performing. I went to college, I majored in theater, and then I majored in theater education. I then taught both middle school and high school drama, actually down in the Carolinas. And then I moved to New York City and ran a theater company successfully for about 7 years. I also stage managed shows off Broadway. So just so you know the difference, I guess, there's off Broadway. Houses are 99 and down. Off Broadway is from 100 to, I believe, a couple thousand, and then above that is Broadway. So it's not the location, it's the size of your audience that basically states what you are. And so I did work myself up to stage managing off Broadway, very large shows there for that size. But my theater company hit a snag when the recession hit. Just so happened that we had taken a chance on a very different script where I'd written part of it and then we'd used the script. And, we were taking chances because we were doing really well. And then the recession hit and we were like, oh, ow. And that was around the time that my team needed to branch off. Someone was going to get married. Someone was going to act professionally full time. So we stopped and I said, you know what? I'm either going to go to grad school for directing, or I'm going to see if I can get published. And I was like, and here's what's funny. I was like, I'll give it 2 years and I'll make my decision. Looking back, that was ridiculously silly. However, I did sell a book in the first year to a small press publisher, and that made my decision for me. So hence I'm here today. But I took that and I did end up being asked to write a web series and create a web series called Sky of the Damned. There's book 1 and book 2 right there. Book 1 is based on the web series itself. It's free online. You can watch it there's 6 episodes. Sky is spelled with an E. It's hard to read the red print here, but Sky of the Damned. We filmed 6 episodes, raised the money for it, I cast it, did all of that. I only didn't direct one of the episodes because one of my other people wanted to give it a shot, and I was like, yeah, my cinematographer, he wanted to direct an episode, so I let him. But I was on set to be there for the actors because there was a huge fight scene that I was helping with and all of that. So it was 60 people in the room, 30 of which were fighters. So yeah, it was insane because obviously I just can't just keep things small. I was raised doing Shakespeare, and so it's big cast, lots of people.
Lots of people with lots of action and lots of talking. AJ, were you ever on the stage, or were you always directing or backstage or commenting on it as an academic?
I've been on stage some. It's not really my strong suit, I don't think. So mostly I direct, and as I say, for most of the professional work I've done has been as a dramaturg, but I direct a lot in college productions as well.
Good dramaturg is the thing of glory.
Yes. How did you transition from that to fiction? I mean, I know that it's publish or perish in the academic world. That's not an issue, how you did the nonfic. But how did you transition from teaching, researching, and writing and publishing nonfiction and directing to the fiction?
It wasn't really a transition. I was doing all of them simultaneously. In fact, I think I wrote certainly I wrote my first novel before I directed my first full production. Though not by much. I mean, it was months apart rather than years. So they've always kind of gone hand in hand.
Was there always a synergy between them?
Yeah.
Or was it a hard back and forth to switch back and forth?
I think one of there are obviously, as this panel suggests, a lot of points of contact between the two, but there are also a lot of differences. And one of the differences is that as a novelist, you are, to a large extent, in charge of your product. It's a solo thing. Whereas when you're doing theater, by definition, it's a collaborative endeavor, right? And as a director, you can't try to overrule or force that collaborative essential element of what theater is, right? So sometimes it feels like I'm using 2 very different parts of my brain. When I'm working on a major production for which I know that I'm going to be in rehearsal for, I don't know, 6 weeks, I almost never try to write first draft fiction at the same time. I can edit, I can polish, but it's such a different thing. And because of my personality, I know that I'm going to completely immerse myself in what I'm doing, and I just can't have 2 things going at the same time. So I tend to compartmentalize and try to keep them separate, even though in many ways there's a lot of similarity in terms of a creative, both are essentially about telling story, so.
Alledria, what about you? I know you said that you started reading everything in the house by the time you were 10. What got you, then you've discovered, this wonderful thing called acting. What got you into writing fiction? Was it something you were doing from a very young age forward? Was it something that was interrupted? How did that happen?
I started writing fiction by the time I was 10 years old. I was rewriting the ends of books. I was basically doing fan fiction when fan fiction was still done by fanzines and you printed it out and you mailed them to people. But I was doing them just for me, just for my own edification. And then as I got older, I got into I got out of that mode and into online role play, which is also a form of acting now that I think about it, but it was very text-based. And then I moved from my friend D.E. Morris dared me to write a book. We were in online role play together, and she dared me to write a book, and she introduced me to NaNoWriMo. For those of you who don't know what that is National Novel Writing Month. It is done in November of every year. And I started that in '05, and I have done NaNoWriMo pretty much every year since then. And I wrote my first book in '05. It will never see the light of day because I was handling some emotional problems at the time. But that was my first book. I wouldn't publish my first book until 10 years later, when I published Chains of Fate in 2015, which by then I was already a tour guide. I was already doing the acting thing, and I kind of drifted in and out of doing the tour guiding thing and writing books, and it kind of smoothed back and forth for a while. And then I stepped out of tour guiding for a couple of years so that I could focus on other jobs, and I was still writing. I've been writing pretty much consistently. My 39th birthday was yesterday.
Oh, happy birthday.
So I've been writing consistently since I was about 8 years old. So about 31 years I've been writing consistently. And I would like to say that I've gotten better, but there are still first drafts I look at even after 30 years. I look at my first draft for some things like that I wrote in the last 6 months, and girl, what were you thinking?
It's okay.
I think we all have that feeling. Tamsin, was the break that you mentioned, after the recession that caused the problems with the theater company, was that break your first foray into fiction, or had you been toying with it beforehand?
I think I wrote my first book as a senior in high school by hand. I still have it. And I don't think I'll ever type that up. I know for a fact that after I wrote it, I thought to myself, isn't there a character that suddenly disappeared in the middle? Like, I was like, that might be a problem. But I wrote it. It was called Bloody Murder. Ever played the game Bloody Murder as a kid? It's kind of like hide and seek. It's called Bloody Murder. Anyway, someone dies in the theater at a college during the game, but I was writing that, and I still have it. I mean, I can picture it. It travels with me every time I move. And but I didn't really sit down, and I would spend hours on the weekend on my dad's electric typewriter because I'm old, and I would write short stories, which I can't do now very well. But I would write stories, and I loved being down there because I love nothing more than telling a story, which is probably why I liked acting. And then as I got older, I found I liked directing, because directing, now I get to not just shape this one individual, I get to shape all of it, right? I get to kind of help shape the story in general. So I don't know if I guess that might seem like it was natural progression that I then became the artistic director, where then I was shaping a season and I was shaping an entire look of something by how things were designed as well as how things were acted and built. So I think that for me, it was just sort of a progression of storytelling. And I really, this is going to sound hilarious. So the movie that pushed me to get my book done was Twilight. So I know, not because I was
just saying, that's so glad something good came out of it.
Right. What happened was I and the whole reason I went to go see it was that there was a lot of talk. And of course, all of a sudden there's that fear that someone's telling your story, right? Because in college, I wrote a book, which is now published, which is Windfire. And I had written that in my senior year of college. and it was sitting on a floppy disk. Yeah. And so I decided finally, I was like, if you're really that worried that someone's going to tell the story you want to tell, then maybe you should sit your butt down and you should get it done. So I found it and I retyped the whole thing. And because I found it printed, I couldn't get it. I was only able to get it printed off that disc. We couldn't get it to save. So we printed it and I retyped the whole thing and went and worked. That's the book that I sold in 20.
Oh, okay, cool. What about you, Doc? When you said that it was podcasting that really got you into writing
said
fiction?
that I fell in with a group of podcasters, and the reality is I fell in with a group of podcast novelists.
Ah,
These were people who were all writers, and in order to build an audience, they started podcasting their books chapter by chapter,
right.
in order to and putting them out there for free to get an audience. And when you hang out with a bunch of podcast novelists, there are two things that they ask you. And one is, what's your podcast? And the other one is, what are you writing?
Mm-hmm.
So I say that I succumbed to peer pressure. I ended up starting a podcast on my weight loss journey called the Shrinking Man Project. And that lasted for a couple of years. And I started a tech blog because I figured it didn't matter what you wrote, as long as you wrote something, you'd get better at it. But about 6 months into writing the Nifty Tech blog, I started writing short stories and submitting them off to other short story podcasts. And it's like the first story I sent was to a podcast where they give you a picture prompt and you write the story on it. And I hadn't heard anything back for a month. And I sent a note and I said, it's like, I didn't expect to get accepted or anything, but I haven't heard anything. I at least hope to get a little bit of feedback. And they said, oh, we're so sorry, it drops on Sunday. They had already accepted it and recorded it and scheduled it, and they had just forgotten to tell me. And at that point, I figured it's like, okay, apparently I've got a little bit of talent with a turn of phrase, and maybe I should try something more ambitious. One of the other podcasts that I was on was about writing, and the first year I was on it, they were talking up NaNoWriMo, and I wasn't prepared, wasn't doing NaNoWriMo, so I said, okay, next year I'll do NaNoWriMo. So in 2011, my NaNoWriMo project, which I thought I was going to do several short stories and just try to get 50,000 words, that ended up being The Perils of Prague, and my first novel, and it was the only time I actually won NaNoWriMo, as I actually got 50,000 words done and looked at the story and said, I'm only about 2/3 of the way through.
It happens that way sometimes, but
Yeah.
you did get the first one out, which is always the hardest. A brief public service announcement. Judy Black had to drop out due to a storm. She'll rejoin us if she can. So
she has
just,
no power.
yeah, that's always something. Okay, there is a lot of story here from everybody, but I do want to get at one key question. Is the synergy that comes from the stage or video or acting or all forms of drama, if you will, and fiction, narrative fiction writing. Okay, we've talked about how collaborative a theater production or any production is. We've talked about, how adjust your vision, your way of looking at things. So could we talk about the ways that it has contributed directly to your fiction? And I'll start with you, Tamsin.
I think it has connected directly in the idea of not just dialogue, because like when I sat down, they said, "Hey, will you write this web series?" I was like, okay, but I had never really gotten into writing scripts or plays, but I understood dialogue. And I didn't realize, I think that really came from the time I spent doing theater, but also a lot of people, when they read my things, are like, I can see this, I can visualize what you're writing. And I think that directly comes from the fact that when I'm writing it, I picture stuff like I would on stage. All right, someone has to cross in here if they're here, or if a fight is going on, I can't pick up a sword in both hands and then pick up my knife. So when you do fight work, you have to really think about that. And I think that the process of how a scene moves and how a fight scene moves has helped me, as well as just growing up in theater and seeing, really well written scripts and how they move and how they keep the attention of an audience. I think that also is something that helps me. At least I hope it does.
Okay. Doc, what about you? What is the biggest contribution your stage and or podcasting experience has made to your fiction?
I feel like my stage experience and honestly, a lot of the role play experience has really helped me in creating characters, in understanding, being able to flesh out who the person is, understanding them and their motivations, and being able to run multiple characters in my head at the same time. I do something I call three-person banter, where I've got people asking questions and interrupting and supplying answers back and forth. And that's all because of, and that all comes out of the theater experience. Another big thing, which is the sense of timing. Because I say that I bill myself as a steampunk author, but I say that I write steampunk comedy adventure. And whenever you're doing comedy, you need to have a good sense of timing. And because I can basically hear myself acting the characters out in my head, and that stage presentation and that timing that I learned in theater can help come across in the writing and let me choose the right words to time things out so that someone reading it gets the same sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Alledria, what about you? How has your acting experience contributed to your writing?
Verbal tics and costuming. Because verbal tics, the way people speak, especially when they are handed a piece of dialogue, their accent, the words that they would rather use, they become, it's something that I can hear. Like, take a country boy and tell him that he gonna do Shakespeare, and then you're gonna get something really different from what you think it's supposed to sound like if you are a Shakespearean actor, because he's gonna stumble. He's gonna look at these words and he's gonna go, okay, what is that word? And then when you tell him what it means, he's like, why can't I just say it the way I would say it? And then costuming, which is something I don't think any of us have touched on, is very important to how a character carries themselves. Like, you wouldn't necessarily, like, there's a very early section in, I want to say, Penny Dreadfuls, where she is talking to him and she tells him about himself, and tells one of the main characters about himself based on what she observes about his dress. I mean, you got a gun, but you got a threadbare coat. Your heels have been repaired. These things are things that tell you about the character without you having to say, this character comes from money, but they ain't got no money right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that we want to make sure that we do in fiction, because of course, it's show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good point. And as soon as you mentioned it, I realized that I do some of that.
Cool. AJ, what about you? What were the skills, the most important skills you brought from your experiences in the theater to your fiction?
I mean, I think kind of like everybody has said, dialogue particularly, and that sense of character voice that when, you should be able to take a page of dialogue from a novel, tags, and still know who the characters are, because you should be able to hear it, right? And I think that that's something that you get the hang of in the theater, right? Listening to the way that people phrase, whatever their ideas are. And I think also, as Tamsin says, visuals, that sense of remembering that story is always ultimately about people, and it's always anchored by place. And sometimes when I'm writing, if I think too much of the novel as a novel, I can forget where we are, and it becomes sort of talking heads that get abstracted. And it's good, I think, to sort of remember that we want to be able to see this, and that means nailing it down and putting it in a particular place. Or if it's, as has also been said, if it's about costuming or something, that gives the scene a specificity that allows people to visualize it and to sort of put themselves in that sequence. What else? Questions of motivation, I think, modern 20th century onwards, actors always think in terms of motivation. And I think that that's an essential element for all writing. You have to be constantly thinking about why your characters are doing things, because if that doesn't feel genuine, then it knocks the reader out of the story. I don't understand why your character is doing that. I know that you want them to get killed in the basement by the monster, but why did they go down there? Because that's really stupid, those kind of things. And then also the flip side, which is that as actors learn the hard way, motivation isn't enough to convey to an audience what you want them to think of you, right? That your motivation as an actor doesn't necessarily get it done. Sometimes there have to be other things sending signals to the audience to sort of nudge them in the direction that you want them to go in terms of interpreting character, whether that's a musical cue or a lighting cue or something else that sort of manipulates the audience emotionally. And sometimes you have to do that as a novelist as well. The fact that you sympathize with your character is not necessarily enough to make your audience sympathize with them.
Yeah, the reason why so many people default to pretty is good and ugly is bad, because it's an easy visual cue. And it's lazy writing, but yeah, we've been doing it for thousands of years because, okay, just one more question before we have to wrap up. And that is, for those writers out there, because I know that ConTinual's audience is composed of a lot of aspiring writers as well as writers. For those writers out there who do not have the benefit of background in theater or stage or video, how can they get those skills? How can they get that way of looking at a story, a world? So, AJ, any thoughts on that? You're the teacher in the group.
The one thing I will always say is see lots of productions, particularly productions of plays you think you know. And, I'm a Shakespearean. So, people always say to me, oh, well, did this show get it right? I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Get it right. As a Shakespearean, I don't go to the theater expecting them to get it right or get it wrong. I go wanting to be shown something I've never seen before. I want to hear a line in a way I've never heard it before. I want to understand a character a way I've never seen before. So I think that, one of the things is that, obviously this is true with Shakespeare, but with all scripts, there's a lot of stuff in the script. But theater is by definition a constructive as well as an interpretive endeavor, that you bring all kinds of things that are not in the script. And that's the way it should be. You know, so I think that simply what I would advise is see lots of theater, and don't simply rely on movies, but go and be in a show so that you see things according to the sight lines. Go back and see it again, see what you see differently the next time around, see multiple productions of the same play. That's what I would say.
Okay. Alledria?
I do think that you should, if you can't get access to theater, like AJ says, movies are a decent secondary, and you have to not only see the Shakespeare or the play as it would have been done in the theater, but as it's been reimagined. So that way you get the idea that the base understanding is not the only understanding. Just because we have this idea that this is supposed to be done this way doesn't mean that it has to be done this way. As
it should
one of
never
my,
be done that way.
yes, that is very true. It's like you look at it, and if you're thinking, if it's the first thing that comes to mind, as one of my old writing teachers used to say, discard the first three things that come to mind. Discard the first three things that come to mind and look for the fourth thing, the fifth thing, the 10th thing. Because that means that you're starting to think about it in a fresher way. And if you go and you see something and you've seen it, you think you've seen it, you think you know it, go see it again and see if you actually remember it, or if you just think you do. Because if you just think you do, you don't actually know it. You just have this idea in your head.
Okay. Doc, what about you? What would you suggest people who are not involved in theater or acting or?
Listening to the good advice from AJ and Alledria, I find myself wanting to tell people to go and read Shakespeare, because there is so much lovely stuff in Shakespeare. But I realize that a lot of people think of Shakespeare as being lofty material that's very hard to approach. And unfortunately, that's because of the style it was presented in for many, many years. But you have to remember that that Shakespeare was written high for the lords and ladies that could get the theater open so the production could happen. But it was also written for the people in the mud and the dirt, because their coppers were what kept the show going on and meant you got to go home with money. So while you might want to work up to Shakespeare, just read stories aloud. Read stories aloud and do all the voices. And do them in the wrong voices. You learn so much more trying to make the characters true. It's like, do a West Virginia hick Shakespeare. Play with characters. Just have fun with it. And if you find that you're doing okay with that, then find a role-playing group and find a weekly game that you can join and practice developing your own characters and practice relating what those characters want to somebody else.
Okay. What about you, Tamsin? What would your recommendation be?
So I used to teach middle school and high school drama, and one of the things I noticed with my students was that obviously the more theater they did, the better they were getting at also their writing assignments, and just the different types of theater that they experience, different kinds of stories that theater shows they went to see. So I'm just gonna add on to what AJ was saying. Go see theater. Go see it different ways. I cannot count how many times I've seen The Fantastics, or how many times I've seen Hamlet or Midsummer Night's Dream, or how many times I've done it. I mean, when I directed Romeo and Juliet, we set it in New York City, and it was, I had all this original rap music that went with it. Like, we really wanted to turn it different, so it spoke to people who never had experienced before. And I think that that is something that makes a big difference, is going to see as much as you can. But if you have the cojones, take a class. Go take an improv class. Go take just a scene class. You know, a lot of times, obviously right now with the current unpleasantness, sometimes you can't really do that. But I've had friends that are still doing theater classes online, and every Saturday they're working with a scene partner, and they're still doing it. And I would highly recommend that, even with what's going on, if you feel you'd be okay with it, take an improv class, take an acting class, either online or in person, whichever you're more comfortable with, and just see how you do. You don't have to be great. You don't. You just have to experience it. And I think it'll make a big deal of difference for you, no matter how you do.
Okay, great, great. Okay, we are just about out of time. And so I'm going to go around once more, ask you all very quickly to let me know what your current book is and where folks can find you on the web. Alledria?
My most recent book is Alice from Mocha Memoirs Press. You can find me on the web at www.alledriahurt.com.
Mhm.
And I like to say this just because it's cute. If you can spell my first name, I'm the first 5 pages of Google.
Okay, great. AJ?
My last book was Impervious. And
Manly Wade Wellman finalist, right?
yes, thank you.
Congrats.
And you can find me at www.ajhartley.net.
Great, great. Doc?
My latest novel out is The Perils of Prague, but I'm working on the sequel, which is the Kindred of Kali, which will probably be out next year. But and The Shining Cog is a collection of short stories, 4 of which are still in the same world as Perils of Prague. You can find that and a couple other anthologies that I've done just by searching Doc Coleman's Steampunk. That'll bring up my Amazon page, that'll bring up my web page. You'll be good to go.
Okay, great. And Tamsin?
You can find everything about me at tamsinsilver.com. You can also probably find stuff about me at Falstaff. For what's coming out next for me is the 3rd book in the trilogy of the Untold Legends with Falstaff. So the 3rd book is The Murder of Cricket Kugler, based on the life of a young girl who was killed in Las Cruces, New Mexico, that was never solved, that murder. So it continues the story from the first 2. And so that should be out hopefully by the end of this year. And other than that, I'll be working on the 3rd installment of the Sky of the Dam series.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. And thank you out there in the audience for ConTinual, the convention that never ends.